She didn't look like a killer. She looked like someone who had missed 3 nights of sleep and desperately needed an iron for her flight suit. The F-22 jocks laughed when she tripped on the hangar threshold. They weren't laughing when the engines choked at 30,000 feet. The ready room smelled intensely of stale coffee, burnt ozone from the overhead fluorescent fixtures, and the sharp, minty tang of someone's expensive cologne. Jordan Wells sat in the corner, staring into a ceramic mug that held a liquid blacker and thicker than engine oil. She took a sip. It was lukewarm and tasted like copper and regret. She didn't grimace. She just swallowed it, letting the caffeine hit her empty stomach with a dull thud. She was 31, but the lighting in the briefing room drew harsh shadows under her eyes, adding a decade to her face. Her flight suit was a size too big, the fabric bunching awkwardly around her shoulders. The Velcro patch on her left arm was bare. She had stripped her squadron insignia, her flight hours, her weapons school grad patch, everything, before stepping onto Elmendorf Richardson. Now she just had a name tape. Wells. The door banged open. The bitter Alaskan wind howled for a fraction of a second before the heavy steel door slammed shut behind Cole Davis and Bradley Henderson. Cole stripped off his winter gloves, slapping them against his thigh. He was textbook fighter pilot. Tall, square-jawed, vibrating with a kind of restless, arrogant energy that demanded oxygen from whatever room he entered. Bradley was his shadow, slightly shorter but walking with the same wide-stanced swagger. "God, it is a miserable grey toilet out there today," Cole announced to no one in particular. He tossed his helmet bag onto the worn leather sofa. He paused, his eyes landing on Jordan. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked at her bare shoulder patch, then down to her scuffed, unpolished boots. "You the new body?" Cole asked. His tone wasn't openly hostile, just laced with the casual dismissal reserved for the unimportant. "Yeah," Jordan said. Her voice was quiet, slightly raspy. She went to set her mug down on the table, misjudged the distance, and the ceramic clanked hard against the edge. Her pen rolled off her notepad and clattered to the linoleum floor. She let out a quiet sigh, dropping to one knee to fish the pen out from under the table. Her left knee let out an audible, wet pop as she crouched. Above her, Cole caught Bradley's eye and smirked. "Careful down there. Try not to pull a hamstring before the briefing." Jordan found the pen. It was covered in a thin film of dust. She wiped it on her pant leg and stood back up, offering a tight, close-lipped smile. "I'll manage." "Right," Cole said, turning his back to her and pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Word is you rotated in from a cargo wing down south. C-17S? Or was it tankers? I didn't see it on the manifest." "Something like that," Jordan lied smoothly. She sat back down. She picked at a hangnail on her left thumb. She wasn't annoyed by the disrespect. She was actually relieved. Being ignored was safe. Being underestimated required zero energy to maintain. She was so tired. She just wanted to do her rotation, stare at the flat Alaskan horizon, and go back to her dim apartment to eat cold cereal over the sink. The door opened again, and Commander Mitchell strode in. The room snapped to attention. Jordan stood, her posture slouching slightly compared to the rigid, chest-out stances of the 2 younger men. "Take a seat," Mitchell barked, dropping a thick manila folder onto the podium. He pulled down the projector screen with a loud snap. The screech of the dry erase marker against the whiteboard set Jordan's teeth on edge. "Standard intercept drill today. 2 versus 2 up in the northern operating area. The weather is garbage, low ceiling, but we've got clear air above 20,000. Viper, your flight lead." Cole nodded sharply. "Copy that, sir. Who's flying my wing?" Mitchell didn't look up from his notes. "Wells is your wingman." Cole's posture stiffened. He shot a glance back at Jordan, who was currently drawing tiny, overlapping circles in the margins of her notebook. "Sir, with respect," Cole said, his voice dropping to a serious, hushed register. "This is a high G bracket. We're pushing the F-22 to the edge of the envelope today to test the new software patch. I need a wingman who can keep up. No offense to Wells, but if she's fresh off a heavy jet rotation—" "I didn't ask for your personnel review, Viper," Mitchell interrupted, his voice flat. He looked at Jordan. For a split second, there was something in the commander's eyes. Not respect, exactly, but a heavy, silent acknowledgement. "Wells knows the aircraft. She's current. Keep her in your pocket. Run the drill. Come home." Briefing dismissed. As the room cleared out, Cole grabbed his helmet bag, walking past Jordan's desk. He leaned in slightly, smelling heavily of spearmint gum and arrogance. "Look, Wells," Cole muttered, keeping his voice low. "I don't know who you pissed off to get dumped in a frontline Raptor squadron, but out there today, just stay out of my way. Don't crowd my airspace, don't clutter the comms. Just be a good little ghost on the radar and follow me home. Understood?" Jordan stopped drawing circles. She looked up. Her eyes were an incredibly pale shade of hazel, flat and deadened. She didn't blink. "Copy," she said quietly. Cole frowned, momentarily unsettled by the absolute lack of emotion in her face, before shaking his head and walking out. Jordan sat alone for a moment. She looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were covered in faint, silvery scars. She closed her eyes, listening to the rattle of the exhaust fan in the ceiling. It sounded exactly like the failing auxiliary power unit of a jet burning out in the desert sun. She swallowed the metallic taste in her mouth, picked up her helmet, and walked out into the cold. The cold on the flight line was physical. It felt like someone pressing a sheet of ice against her face. The smell of JP-8 jet fuel hung thick in the heavy, damp air, mixing with the sharp scent of wet concrete. Jordan walked around the sleek, grey belly of her F-22 Raptor. She ran her bare hand along the cold, composite skin of the wing. It was a beautiful machine, deadly, incredibly expensive, and utterly unforgiving of human error. She climbed the yellow ladder, feeling the familiar heavy weight of the survival vest and G-suit pulling at her shoulders. Dropping into the ejection seat, the world shrank. The cockpit smelled like aged rubber, electronics, and the faint, sour ghost of previous pilots' sweat. She strapped in. The mechanical procedure of clicking the harnesses together was pure muscle memory. Her hands moved over the switches without conscious thought. Battery on, APU start, avionics powering up. As the canopy lowered and locked into place with a heavy, pressurized seal, the noise of the wind outside was instantly muted, replaced by the low, steady hiss of her own oxygen mask. "Tower, Viper 01, flight of 2, requesting taxi." Cole's voice crackled in her headset. Crisp, confident, eager. "Viper 01, cleared to taxi." Jordan pushed the throttle forward. The jet shuddered, a beast waking up, and rolled out behind Cole's aircraft. Takeoff was violent. It always was. The twin engines screamed, kicking her violently back into the ejection seat. The physical crush of the G-force sat on her chest like an anvil as the runway blurred into a grey smear. And suddenly, they were tearing through the low cloud deck. They punched through the weather at 18,000 feet. Above the clouds, the sky was a brilliant, indifferent, bruised purple. The sun was blinding, casting razor-sharp shadows across the interior of the cockpit. For 40 minutes, it was routine. Boring, even. Cole was pushing hard, yanking his jet through aggressive maneuvers, trying to force Jordan out of position. He was talking constantly on the intra-flight radio, calling out simulated kills, his breathing heavy and excited under the G-load. Jordan stayed perfectly on his wing. She didn't speak. She just made microscopic adjustments to her throttle and stick, anticipating his turns before he even made them. Her body absorbed the G-forces with a practiced, numbed endurance. The G-suit squeezed her legs like blood pressure cuffs, forcing the blood back into her brain. She tasted old pennies on her tongue, the familiar flavor of adrenaline creeping into her system. She pushed it down. Then came the sound. Even through the noise-cancelling helmet, through the thick glass of the canopy, she heard it. A deep, hollow thump. It wasn't the sound of a system failing. It was the sound of metal breaking. A heavy vibration immediately rattled through Jordan's teeth, translating through the air between the two jets. "Knock it off," Cole said over the radio. The cockiness was instantly gone. His voice was tight, pitched higher. "I've got a master caution. Engine 1 is spooling down. I'm getting a compressor stall warning." Jordan gently banked her jet, sliding out to the right to get a clear view of Cole's exhaust nozzles. A thin, angry ribbon of black smoke was bleeding from his left engine. "Copy that, Viper," the AWACS controller, call sign Overlord, responded. The controller sounded bored, sitting in a radar plane hundreds of miles away. "Terminate the drill. Return to base." "Yeah, turning south now," Cole started. The second explosion cut him off. It was massive. A brilliant, jagged tongue of orange flame vomited out of the side of Cole's fuselage, instantly peeling back a section of the radar-absorbent skin. The shockwave visibly rippled the air. "Fire! Fire!" Cole screamed. The radio blew out with a screech of static as his voice broke into full-blown panic. "I've got firelights on both engines. Oh God, hydraulics are zeroing. The stick is dead." Jordan watched Cole's jet violently yaw to the left. The nose pitched up uncontrollably, the horizontal stabilizers shuddering wildly as they lost hydraulic pressure and fought against the thin air. The jet was entering an unrecoverable flat spin. "Viper, eject!" Bradley's voice shouted over the net from the secondary element miles away. "Pull the handle, Cole. Get out." "I can't." Cole was hyperventilating now. The sound of his jagged, terrified breathing filled the comms network. "The canopy lock is jammed. The manual override won't pull. I'm losing cabin pressure. I can't breathe. Panic is contagious." Jordan could hear Bradley starting to yell over the AWACS controller, who was now rapidly demanding altitude and heading updates. The radio was a chaotic, overlapping mess of terrified young men screaming. Jordan closed her eyes for half a second. A deep, heavy sigh escaped her lips. Her stomach churned. She hated this. She hated the noise. She hated the frantic, desperate sound of a pilot realizing they were strapped into a burning coffin. It dragged her violently back to a memory of a desert sky she had spent 3 years trying to drink away. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly in the briefing room, were suddenly completely still. An uncomfortable, almost predatory calm washed over her mind. The messy, tired woman in the oversized flight suit vanished. She reached out and keyed her mic. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It was flat, rhythmic, and as cold as the ice on the tarmac below. It cut through the screaming on the radio like a scalpel. "Viper, this is your wingman. Shut your mouth and breathe." The absolute authority in her tone caused a momentary, stunned silence on the network. Even Cole stopped yelling, gasping for air in his failing mask. "Wax, this is flight lead," Jordan stated. Her eyes locked on the burning jet as she pushed her throttle forward, sliding dangerously close to Cole's aircraft. She could see him thrashing in the cockpit through the heat blur. "Viper is combat ineffective. I am taking control of this airspace." Negative, wingman," the AWACS controller stammered, confused by the sudden breach of protocol. "Viper is flight lead. Who is this? Identify." Jordan banked within 20 feet of Cole's wing. She could see the fire eating through the root of the wing, the composite material melting like plastic. "Overlord, I am not asking," Jordan said, her voice dead entirely of emotion. "Run a trace on my transponder serial and clear the damn frequency." A 5-second pause hung in the air. Nothing but the sound of static and Cole's weeping breathing. Then the AWACS controller's voice came back. The bureaucratic boredom was entirely gone. He sounded like a man who had just seen a ghost on his radar screen. "Jesus Christ! Stand by. All aircraft in the northern sector, hold positions. Airspace is yours. Karen." Another beat of silence. Then Bradley's voice clicked over the intra-flight frequency. Barely a whisper, horrified and completely stripped of his earlier swagger. "Karen, as in the Baghdad airspace Karen." The silence on the radio was heavier than the G-force. The name Karen didn't belong here in the frozen, pale skies of Alaska. It belonged to a classified after-action report buried in the Pentagon, detailing a night over the Syrian border where a lone pilot had guided 3 crippled, blind jets through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, doing things with aerodynamics that the engineers swore were mathematically impossible. Jordan hated the name. To them, it was a ghost story. To her, it was the worst night of her life, measured in gallons of sweat and the smell of burning wiring. "Shut up, Bradley," Jordan snapped, her voice devoid of the earlier quiet deference. She was entirely in the cockpit now. The world outside the canopy was just physics and geometry. Cole's F-22 was falling out of the sky like a dead leaf, spinning lazily on its horizontal axis. The right wing was engulfed in a thick, greasy black fire that was eating the composite skin alive. The altimeter on Jordan's heads-up display ticked down violently. 15,000. 14. "I'm at 12,000, Cole choked out. He sounded like a child. The bravado had completely dissolved, replaced by the ugly, raw sound of a human animal facing its own end. "The manual release is locked. The heat warped the frame. I'm going to burn. I'm going to—" "You're not going to burn," Jordan said. She didn't shout. She pitched her voice low, transmitting a manufactured calm she absolutely did not feel. Underneath her flight suit, her shirt was soaked. A cold drop of sweat carved a path down her spine. "Look at your altimeter, Cole. Focus on the numbers. Read them to me." 10,000, 9.5. "Good. Keep reading." Jordan pushed her throttles past the military detent, slamming them into full afterburner. The twin F-119 engines howled, kicking her squarely in the spine as her jet accelerated straight down. She wasn't going to talk him through a mechanical failure. His jet was a brick. To break a flat spin, you needed airflow over the control surfaces, and Cole had none. He was just dropping. To give him airflow, she had to change the atmosphere around him. "AWACS, I am entering the spin," Jordan stated. "Karen, negative, negative," Overlord shouted, the panic bleeding back into his voice. "He's a fiery debris hazard. You violate the safety bubble, you'll take a mid-air collision." Jordan reached out and killed her radio uplink to the AWACS. The sudden quiet in her helmet was a relief. She banked hard left, pulling 7 Gs. The pressure crushed her chest, forcing the air from her lungs in a sharp grunt. Her vision narrowed, a grey vignette creeping into the edges of her eyesight. She squeezed her core muscles, forcing the blood back up, and leveled out directly beneath Cole's burning, spinning jet. The proximity warning alarm in her cockpit instantly lost its mind. Pull up, warning, collision," the synthetic female voice screamed over the blaring klaxon. Jordan ignored it. She stared up through her canopy at the belly of Cole's Raptor, now less than 50 feet above her and dropping fast. She could see the individual rivets. She could see the blistering paint. "Cole, brace for impact," Jordan said. "What? What impact?" Jordan didn't answer. She pulled her stick back and chopped her throttles. She intentionally threw her perfectly functional F-22 into a high alpha stall, hanging the jet on the raw thrust of her engines directly in Cole's downward path. It was an incredibly stupid, suicidal maneuver. The wake turbulence from her twin engines created a massive, violent vortex of disturbed, high-pressure air thrusting straight up. Cole's falling jet hit that invisible wall of turbulence. The physics were brutal. The upward blast of Jordan's exhaust slammed into the tail of Cole's jet. The impact was entirely aerodynamic, but it hit like a freight train. Cole's nose violently pitched down, snapping the flat spin. Above her, Cole screamed as the sudden shift in gravity threw him violently against his shoulder harnesses. The F-22 dropped its nose, biting into the air. "You have airspeed," Jordan barked, dumping her nose to dive away before his jet could crash down onto hers. "You're out of the spin. Try the canopy handle now." The change in altitude and the sudden, violent jolt of the nose-down attitude shifted the warped airframe just a fraction of an inch. "I'm pulling," Cole grunted, the sound of tearing metal echoing through his open mic. It's giving." With a deafening crack, the explosive bolts fired. Jordan looked back over her shoulder, just in time to see the heavy polycarbonate canopy rip away from Cole's jet, tumbling into the slipstream. A microsecond later, a column of white smoke erupted from the cockpit, followed by the ejection seat rocketing into the freezing Alaskan sky. The burning F-22 continued its death dive, vanishing into the grey cloud deck below. Jordan throttled back. The deafening roar of the afterburners faded into a steady hum. She watched the orange and white canopy of Cole's parachute deploy, a tiny, fragile jellyfish floating against the bruised purple sky. "Viper 01 has ejected," Jordan said, clicking her radio back to the AWACS frequency. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, swallowed the dry copper taste on her tongue, and tried again. "Good shoot. Mark his coordinates for search and rescue." "Copy, Karen. We have him on radar. Rescue choppers are scrambling from Elmendorf now," Overlord replied. The controller's voice was remarkably quiet, reverent almost. Jordan hated that tone. "My call sign is Wells," she said flatly. "Returning to base." She didn't wait for a reply. She banked south. Inside the cockpit, the adrenaline began to retreat, leaving a toxic sludge in its wake. Her hands started to shake. It began as a fine tremor in her fingers and rapidly escalated into a violent shivering that traveled up her forearms. She squeezed the control stick until her knuckles turned white, trying to physically force her body to remain still. It didn't work. The smell of the rubber oxygen mask suddenly turned her stomach. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, taking slow, ragged breaths through her nose, fighting the overwhelming urge to vomit. She wasn't an ice-cold killer. She wasn't a legend. She was just a tired woman who was desperately, horribly afraid of the sky, yet somehow couldn't stay on the ground. The runway at Elmendorf-Richardson was slick with a fresh layer of freezing rain by the time Jordan's tires slammed onto the concrete. The landing wasn't pretty. It was hard, fast, and entirely devoid of the smooth elegance she normally prided herself on. She was just done flying. She wanted the earth beneath her feet. She taxied into the hangar area. The base was swarming. Fire trucks, ambulances, and security forces vehicles were everywhere, their red and blue lights flashing rhythmically against the grey concrete and the heavy, overcast sky. Jordan shut down the engines. As the massive turbines spooled down, the silence in the cockpit felt heavy and suffocating. She went through the shutdown checklist. Her hands were still clumsy. She dropped her flight log onto the floorboards. She stared at it for a long moment, lacking the energy to bend down and retrieve it. The canopy whined as it lifted. The freezing Alaskan air rushed in, smelling of pine needles, wet pavement, and exhaust. It was the best thing she had ever smelled. She unhooked her oxygen mask, letting it dangle against her chest. She undid the heavy harness, the buckles clicking loudly in the quiet hangar. When she climbed down the yellow ladder, her left knee popped again. The pain was sharp and grounded her in reality. A small crowd was waiting for her on the tarmac. Commander Mitchell stood at the front, his arms crossed over his chest. Behind him was Bradley, his flight suit still on, his face the color of wet chalk. Several crew chiefs and maintenance personnel were hovering in the background, staring at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Jordan didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on the ground. She walked around the nose of her jet, her boots heavy on the wet concrete. "Wells," Mitchell said as she approached. His voice was entirely stripped of the abrasive bark he used in the briefing room. Jordan stopped. She didn't salute. She didn't snap to attention. She just looked at him, her pale hazel eyes exhausted and empty. "Cole is in the dirt," Mitchell said quietly. "Pararescue just picked him up. He's got a broken collarbone from the ejection and some frostbite, but he's alive. He's coming home." Jordan gave a slow, minimal nod. "Good." Bradley stepped forward. He looked like he was vibrating. The cocky, arrogant kid from the briefing room was entirely gone, replaced by someone who had just looked over the edge of a cliff and realized how far the drop was. "You," Bradley started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard. "You threw your jet into a high alpha stall, directly under a falling, burning 50-ton aircraft, to create a wake trap." Jordan wiped her forehead with the back of her Nomex glove. It came away stained with a mixture of sweat and grime. "I wanted to go home, Henderson," Jordan said. Her voice was raspy, completely devoid of theatrics. "And I didn't want to fill out the paperwork for a dead wingman." Bradley just stared at her. "They said Karen was a myth, a combat rumor. They said no one could actually fly the heavy iron like that." Jordan felt the bile rise in her throat again. The nausea she had fought off in the cockpit was returning with a vengeance. The flashing lights of the fire trucks were triggering a migraine that pounded behind her right eye. She looked at Bradley. She didn't see a fellow pilot. She saw a kid who played a dangerous game because he liked the leather jackets and the watches, completely ignorant of the bill that eventually came due. "There are no myths," Jordan said, her tone suddenly harsh, cutting through the damp air. "There are just people who get lucky and people who burn. Don't romanticize it." She turned away from him and looked back at Commander Mitchell. "Sir, am I debriefing now, or can I get a shower?" Mitchell studied her for a long moment. He looked at her trembling hands, hanging limply at her sides. He looked at the deep, dark circles under her eyes. He didn't see a hero. He saw a liability, a weapon that had been fired too many times and was starting to crack under the pressure. "Go hit the showers, Wells," Mitchell said softly. "Debrief is at 0800 tomorrow. We'll handle the paperwork tonight." "Thank you, sir." Jordan walked past the crowd. The mechanics parted for her, stepping back as if she were radioactive. She didn't acknowledge them. She walked into the squadron building, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry insects. She pushed open the door to the women's locker room. It was empty. It smelled of bleach and damp towels. She walked over to the bank of metal sinks, leaned heavily against the porcelain, and turned on the cold water. She stared at herself in the mirror. She didn't look like a killer. She didn't look like a savior. She looked exactly like what she was, a 31-year-old woman who had missed 3 nights of sleep, whose knee hurt, and who was incredibly, desperately tired. Jordan lowered her head, squeezed her eyes shut, and finally allowed herself to throw up into the sink. The sound echoed off the sterile tile walls, harsh and ugly and completely human. When she was done, she splashed freezing water on her face, grabbed a paper towel, and wiped her mouth. She tossed the towel into the trash, unzipped her flight suit to her waist, and walked toward the showers. Tomorrow, she would have to face the whispers. Tomorrow, she would have to face Cole. But right now, all she wanted was the silence of the falling water. If you felt the adrenaline of this story and the heavy reality of the cockpit, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves aviation, grounded drama, and heroes who carry real weight. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next deep dive narrative. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Jordan's boots? See you in the next one.